Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted. And here we have a Doran the Siege Tower. Let me put that on screen. Treefolk Tribal deck from Jesse. This is looking for you know, general improvements, and they want to be able to close games, win games, finish games using Doran. So as always, the deck list for this deck will be in the video description below, and I highly recommend you go and take a look, see what you can find, see if there's anything you think of that I don't, and please comment below if you have thoughts that I have missed. I am not one that's particularly skilled at tribal decks, so if you see a tribal deck, I'll always need a little more help. So who is Doran and why are we using them as our Treefolk tribal commander? Well, simply put, Doran is a Treefolk, so that's our first step. Doran is an Abzan colors in 3 mana, so a very low mana creature, 0/5. And it says each creature assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power, which is particularly strong when your commander is an O5. So we are going to play Doran, and then we're going to play as many tree folk who are generally known for having more health than power, more toughness than power, that they can now attack. They can punch a weight class above, punch above their weight class. Maybe I'm getting the sayings mixed up, but by flipping their toughness into their power, we are hoping that these creatures will then become much more fearsome at a low opportunity cost of playing our commander. So first thing we want to look at, I always forget in MTG Goldfish to see our stats. We need to press this button. So we can see here we have quite a curve. I don't particularly like the 6 and 7 going on for so high. We have 9 and 6. We have 15 creatures that are 6 mana and more. And we're going to see if this deck can support them. And I'm going to suggest no. Even in this sample hand, we can see we have, what is it, 2 lands. Oh, is this going to go to the page? I don't actually want that. A 5 mana creature. Oh, it's gone now. But there's a 5 mana creature, a 7 mana creature, I think a 4 mana creature. We definitely want to bring down the curve a little bit. So let's refresh this. This is from the previous video. And let's take a look at what we can cut out. One of the first things I want to point out is that Doran is an incredibly low mana commander with a very high power. I don't want to say coefficient, but like, you get a lot of bang from your buck. And so this should be the standard that we're putting all of our, commanders or all of our non-commander tree folk up against. So if let's even assume Doran has already been destroyed once, so we're paying 5 mana. So Doran, at worst, on the second cast is a 5 mana 5/5, and we want every single creature to be better than that at least. The other thing we want to think about is how much we're going to be just generally beating face, and how, like with a bunch of tree folk, and how much the Doran should be carrying us. So the first thing I want to talk about when we think about commander damage is we want to hit 21 as fast as possible. And we want to hit breakpoints. So by that I mean if if your creature has 21 damage, because I was going to say power, but Duran's toughness, does 21 damage per attack or higher, you've hit that breakpoint. You're already doing enough damage with commander in one swipe. If the next point on 2 attacks is 10 or 11, I'm going to say 11 technically, but it's close because sometimes you can add an additional power in between those turns, but 10 or 11 damage. That's 2. Here we are with Doran, who is at 5. The next breakpoint is at 7, and that's pretty doable. I think it's pretty reasonable to be able to push Doran to 7 toughness within this deck. There is a few things that will add a little bit of power to it. armor, slagworm armor, those kind of things that will push Doran into the next bracket. And because of how toughness works, that toughness is easier to add, I think it's reasonable that we can actually push Doran, like once again, slagworm armor represents at putting Doran to 11, which is then 2 attacks. I think the best direction to take this deck is to have the majority of our Treefolk be more support than damage, and then have Doran being the main damage dealer. Now, that being said, all of our Treefolk will still be able to swing in and deal a large amount of damage across the board, but at the moment, you know, we're going to focus on Doran, and then every now and then, if we can swing out the whole team to do like 20 plus damage to a player, that will be very, very nice. And I'm thinking about that because I see creatures in here like Indomitable Ancients, which is a 10/10, quote unquote, for 4 mana. And I think that's fine. I think it's just okay, right? Because it feels really strong, but it is 4 attacks and it has no evasion. So if we're going to keep this creature and types of creatures like this, we need to be able to give them evasion, which we'll get to that in a second. But then even more so, I want to look at something like Silklash Spider. Silklash Spider is a 2/7, which means it's a 5 mana 7/7. And that's too much. That's too much mana for just a 7/7 with no evasion. If these creatures are not going to have evasion, we're going to have to be a little pickier about that. Something like Timber Protector is fantastic because it gives uh, indestructible. Deadwood Treefolk, too much mana. Anything that we're getting over here, if I don't see a very, very high amount of toughness, we're probably should be reconsidering these Treefolk. Something I want to consider is that we're playing an aggro deck, and Treefolk is not traditionally an aggro tribe. This is something, okay, this is the main thing I want people to be thinking about if they build Treefolk, especially Doran. If you're building Treefolk, you are making a tribe that's meant for one thing do another thing. What do I mean by that? Well, Treefolk are supposed to be slow, grindy, and overwhelming your opponents with creatures they have a really hard time defeating. This works really well in uh, draft or cubes, or when you're playing just a format with Treefolk in it, such as like Block Constructed. But when we widen the net and go into full on constructed with like Commander, Treefolk actually aren't particularly good at slowing down the game. They represent things like a ton of life gain and really big bodies. But as most people in Commander have gotten more used to using board clears, used to using non-damage removal, a lot of the perks kind of go away. Even Treefolk's abilities to kind of like put you ahead defensively, such as Orchard Warden's ability to gain you a boggling amount of health as long as you keep playing Treefolk, is really inconsequential when your opponents are ready to take you out with commander damage or otherwise ready to just to grind you into the dust because their cards are just more powerful and kind of specifically powerful against these kind of strategies. So instead, we should be looking at Doran as a 0/5, quote unquote, 5/5 for 3 mana, which is an aggressive stat line for an aggressive commander. So we want to pivot this deck into being aggressive, which is not what Treefolk are good at. So how do we make this switch, right? It seems as if some might say well, it's too much work and let's not do that. And I think that's a mistake in understanding deck building and Magic, is that we just need to adjust the way we think of these cards and use the perks that these cards have in order to make the most of them. So my example here is we're going to play a card called Behind the Scenes. Behind the Scenes is 3 mana, creatures you control have Skulk. For those who have been playing Lord of the Rings, the new pack that came out, You know what Skulk is. Maybe you don't know it by name, but Skulk says creatures cannot be blocked by creatures with higher power. Now, this is really, really good because as you've noticed, creatures like Doran have zero toughness or have a really, really low amount of toughness. Sorry, low power. So Doran actually cannot be blocked outside of walls as long as it has Skulk, which is really, really strong. It gives Doran just pseudo unblockable. And with the additional ability to just put a little bit of extra points into it, you can pump up your team a little more. But the thing that goes a bit further is that this isn't an enchantment that gives like your commander Skulk, it gives everyone Skulk on your side of the field. So creatures like Treefolk Harbinger and not the Tree of Redemption as it cannot attack. Um, I know there has to be one or two more that have zero power, right? I'm not. Well, maybe not. Maybe a lot of them are too high. But at least for okay, Treebeard, Gracious Host as well will have the ability to attack without being blocked. So those ones are really strong because they have zero power, but we have to remember the ones that are close, that have two or one power, also gain this boost, and they become much harder to don't play this. Don't play this. They become much harder to block otherwise. Even Indomitable Ancients gets a bit tougher as you need a creature with two power or less. Now, it's not ideal because one of the problems with Skulk is that if you're playing against a tokens player or a player with a lot like that goes really wide with a low amount of creatures, much like the Winota deck we saw earlier today. Something like two power on a Skulk ends up not being as like it doesn't guarantee unblockability as you'd like, but in my experience, a majority of the time, people whose decks are growing, such as um, Party Time with can never remember her name, but the commander that puts +1/+1 counters, or my Brina deck that puts +1/+1 counters, the small-ish board will grow out of the means to be able to block something with Skulk pretty quickly, right? And if you're playing against a player that has like Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, or like Dark Confidant or the like, even though those creatures can block a power 2 Skulk creatures, oftentimes they don't really want to, and it puts them into kind of a difficult situation. So immediately I think of that. Another way to grab Skulk repeatedly is Call of the Ring, another Lord of the Rings card that I think belongs very much so in a deck like this. For two reasons. One, fantastic that it is a source of repeated card advantage. Two life for a card is kind of a lot, but in a deck like this, when the CMCs run high, it actually, if you think of this as Dark Confidant, you're probably paying around average for 2 mana a card. It also, interestingly enough, says May. I don't know why they go back on these. I think the fun part of black draw spells is that they will kill you in the end. But this one lets you decide whether or not you actually want to draw the cards. I imagine you do. I imagine you do very much. But once again, with how, let's see, the ring works, the first numero uno gives your creature Skulk. So once again, being able to play this after playing Doran or some other combination of your Treefolk allows you to give one of them the first ability of Skulk, which is really strong. And then I would argue the rest of this deck contains cards that benefit from every notch of the ring. The first one, Skulk, is really strong. The second one, which is commonly thought of the strongest, lets you loot and lets you filter through your cards. And the third one, which forces it to be blocked, when it becomes blocked, the creature sacrifices it, which is really interesting because if you don't have Doran or a toughness deals damage ability, the ability to destroy the creatures that have to block your low power tree folk is actually kind of relevant because your 2/10, without a Doran out is just a 2/10, and then has Skulk, and I block with a 2/3, now I have to sacrifice it is actually something worth mentioning. And the last one is just kind of nice for across the board damage. Okay, so general kind of cards there. Another closing the card here is Akroma's Will. Um, you are in white. This is the best finisher in white. It will give you all the protection you need to swing your entire board out. And because of the large amount of toughness across the board, you will generally be particularly happy with the results. So though pricey, this will get the job done. Something else I want to point out that I think that is a card that sometimes sees, you know, I don't want to say like is scoffed at or people don't particularly like. I really like Duelist Heritage. I thought I didn't, you know, I thought it was a weak card, and then I saw it a few times on certain boards, and I have very much so changed my mind on it. Namely, if you think of the equivalent, let's do a search for a an equipment that does the same thing. So let's look at our colors because we notably don't have red. And we're going to look at equipment and we're going to type in double strike. And let's see how many options. Fire Shrieker, I believe, is the cheapest one. Grappling Hook is really interesting, but is a lot. Holy Avenger is also kind of close, but it has a whole aura thing to it. And so a little bit back and forth. Honestly, Fire Shrieker would be the one that you're looking at, and Duelist's Heritage is cheaper than that. It also sticks around whether or not your commander dies or not. And so it's got a bit of lasting power that's particularly good, but also it is a lot of soft power on the board. Every time it is a combat step, you look at your opponents and you say, hey, if you attack so and so, if you don't, or even if you don't attack me, I'll give one of your creatures double strike. That's a pretty attractive offer. Even so, you can make it even easier for them to accept. Let's say I have two creatures, one big, one small, and you say, hey, if you want, you can attack me with the small one, but as long as the big one goes somewhere else, I'll give it double strike. A lot of people measure their ability to play commander and their success with the amount of damage they do or the amount of impact they have. And Duelist Heritage looks at every opponent and says, what if you could double the damage on one of the cards you really like? What if the impact onto the game is double? The fact that will also like keep attention off you because it's their creatures doing the damage. It was their choice to attack them. I know it seems, ooh, excuse me, it seems a little strange, mainly because players should know it's Duelist Heritage that's actually doing the damage in the long run. Uh, I will say they don't seem to notice that. It often comes down to the creature being the problem and not Duelist Heritage. Anyways, all that to say, that will give Doran another option for damage, double strike. With double strike and like slagworm armor, we are now looking at a one shot kill with Doran, which is something I think the deck could very much so benefit from. I'm going to very, very briefly, because I should have also seen if there's anything that also gives Skulk. Skeleton Key. When a creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card if you do. This is interesting. I would consider playing this because it's really, huh. I never thought of this, but this card is the first two parts of the ring put together. Except for instead of on attack, it deals it on combat damage, the second trigger. But once again, this is a bit of card filtration and a way to dig and to give Skulk at a pretty cheap rate to your commander. 1 mana to cast, and then you can just leave it there to equip, is something that I think is definitely worthwhile in a deck like this. All right, let's see what other thoughts I can put into this deck. All right, so by invitation only. Do we not have board clears that depend on power? Is that not something that we have? Destroy all power. It should be power greater, right? Power. There we go. Fell the Mighty is destroy all creatures with power greater than target creature's power. Pick Doran. I think you should be playing Fell the Mighty. It is a fantastic card. And then Battle of Bywater. Destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater, then create a food token for each creature you control. That's pretty strong. I don't know if how much you care about the food tokens. I was sure there was one more of these kind of cards at 3 mana. I think it's like a total power. Let's see. It could be total toughness as well. I remember it being. I remember being 3 mana and it being from not Ixalan, but the dinosaur plane. But I don't see it, so I'm just gonna let it go for now. Or maybe it's sacrifice. Let's see. Slaughter the strong. Each player chooses any number of creatures. Yes, this is it. Each player chooses any number of creatures they control with total power 4 or less, then sacrifices all others they control. So Fell the Mighty and Slaughter the Strong should be your board clears here. I can't believe Slaughter the Strong is like 10 cents. This is a particularly good. I think one of the problems is it does your opponents are able to dodge a lot of this, but you are guaranteed to dodge this. So it's not amazing because it will miss certain things, but on the right boards, it is a 4 mana board, one-sided board clear. But for 2 more mana, you got to play Fell the Mighty. It is very very good here. So those I would replace these board clears with. Um, Reach of the Branches doesn't belong here. I know it's a Treefolk card, but it belongs in like an instant and sorcery deck because you got to not read the Treefolk part and you got to read the return when you play a forest you get this card back and think of it as a card that you tap out with every turn. um Think of that Rashmi deck. Something like that could use it, where you're casting this every turn and getting like the benefits of casting another spell through it. And when it gets back to your turn, you play a force and you return it to your hand. Here, I don't see you holding up 5 mana at instant speed. I don't think that's where it is. Root Grapple, similarly, 5 mana is incredibly high for this effect. I don't care if you draw a card. Uh, if I told you I stapled naturalize and draw a card together, you wouldn't pay 5 mana for it, would you? And especially if I told you it doesn't even always draw a card, I don't think these like especially Root Grapple and Reach, you're not going to be holding up that kind of mana, so you might as well. I just rather naturalize, honestly, or naturalize the 2 mana one? It is. The 1 mana one, nature's. Oops, is it nature's claim? Is always just the correct one to be playing. It's 1 mana. Okay. Then I've said this about the other deck. I'll say this here. A little more card draw would be really, really good here. I'm thinking right away. We've got cards like Phyrexian Arena could be in here. Like we have Painful Truths because it's better than Read the Bones. I agree with that decision. Um, But I think you could also play Read the Bones without much difficulty. And then I think you could also play. So I was saying Phyrexian Arena, which I'll open up. Let me see. Phyrexian Arena can be played here. I think Greed can be played here as you have the ability to hold, like, an extra mana here or there can be very worthwhile in a deck like this. But with the Skulk, the ring, I think the skeleton key and the ring, That'll give you general card draw. If you wanted one more, I think Guardian Project is fine here. It's not crazy good because one of the things that makes Guardian Project very strong is if you can cast multiple creature spells a turn. And that's definitely like more elf centric, more kind of, when you already have tons of mana, you're not going to be able to cast multiple 5 mana spells a turn. So I don't know how good Guardian Project would be here. And then something I was thinking of earlier, it's not card draw, but how do I spell Mirari? Hope that's correct. Mirari's Wake. Let's talk a little bit about ramp. Something like Mirari's Wake, you are in the colors for it. It doubles your mana. I think this is a great inclusion here when a lot of your cards are really, really strong and kind of high mana. In fact, when we look, we've got Farseek, Nature's Lore, and is that it? I think that's it. I think we need some more. I think we need some more ramp. I would be very happy if you played. So, okay, so we're in green. Um, so we can play 2 mana ramp. So, like, our inclination is just to say, hey, why don't we just play 3 visits? Every version of rampant growth we can. But I'm actually going to suggest to you to play the signets. Why? Because you are playing a very color-intensive commander. That's Golgari, Selesnya, and Orzhov are your 3 signets. Your commander is straight up 3 colors. The majority of your deck is green, but your commander is 3 colors, and you need all 3, and you want to play Doran turn 3. And playing any of those signets really, really helps, especially Orzhov's signet, obviously, because it represents both your off colors. And in fact, maybe the best bet is to play Orzhov's signet and Talisman of. Oh no, because Talisman is either or. But still, the Talisman of Hierarchy could also be really good here because it also taps for your off colors. It's just tricky. You have 2 off colors and you really want them. Having the signets help you fix your mana into these 3 colors, which I think is really, really strong because you want to be able to immediately get Doran out. Something like Birds of Paradise, I think, is fine here because once again, it represents every color, albeit being a bad draw later. But at worst, it is a 1-1 with Doran out. I think those are most of my thoughts. I'm going to check how we are on time. Okay, so this is where I'll mainly be closing up. The land base otherwise looks very, very clean. I do really like it. Um, I still wouldn't mind some more ramp. I think I'm going to really quickly point out cards like Ghoul Tree, which just do not belong in this deck because you do not have a way to put your own cards into the graveyard. This is already a 10/10. This doesn't belong in a Doran deck. It belongs in a deck where you can reliably cast it for 1 mana. This is not that deck. Um, Also, much like another giant reach creature that I've seen in the past, do not play this. Do not play a 7 mana 5/7. It is it is very fun to tap out and slam a very big creature, but it's actually not that big. It's 7 mana for a 7/7 Vigilance Trample with Doran out. And I think if you want to close games, you want to lean further on Doran and less so some of these bigger groups. Like, yes, I think if you cut, I would say, quite a few of these higher mana Treefolk, you will probably be a lot happier for it. When we build tribal decks, we shouldn't be playing every member of the tribe we can. We should be playing the best cards. And that's true for any kind of tribe. If you look outside of creature tribal, if I was playing a deck that is like instant or sorcery tribal, for example, with like Riel or something at the front, I would definitely not be playing every instant in sorcery I could. I would be playing the best one. Uh, I am looking forward to the day that someone submits a sliver deck to me because that's going to be a hard one. Well, I hope these additions kind of help out. This deck has a lot it can do. Oh, you're playing Spider Silk armor and Gravity Well. I don't know how afraid you are of flying creatures. I don't think you should be this afraid. These are defensive cards. Once again, this kind of makes sense with Treefolk. Like if I was saying I'm gonna flavorly build a Treefolk deck, I imagine the trees are tall. They're gonna catch the birds that fly by. That's cool. That's neat. I like that. Um, but it's kind of antithetical. It's kind of against what the deck itself wants to do, right? Like that's why I think something like the Duelist's Heritage is so good here because it represents such an aggressive method of taking on your opponents. For the same mana cost, it represents so much damage, whereas Gravity Well doesn't do anything really. Like I'm thinking of even in my decks, like there's a few decks that we play around with that have flyers, but even then, most of them belong in decks that grow really, really like not because they have flying, but +1/+1 counters and the like. And so those creatures still will have the same amount of oomph behind them, whether or not they have literal flying or not. And like if this gave your tree folk flying, maybe I'd be a little more excited for it, but at the moment it doesn't. And if I would rather even just a card that gives your creatures trample, I'm sure that exists for the same mana cost. Something like that would make a lot more sense. Okay, that was one thing I wanted to add in. But otherwise, I think the deck has a lot of potential. I think you should be, if you want the deck to close games, you have to lean on Doran more than you have to lean on anyone else. Doran is very strong, and we should be using them as our main attacker. If you can guarantee them the 6 toughness to turn them into 2 attacks, which I've looking at your deck list, you can if you can give them Skulk to make them unblockable, and or if you can give them Double Strike and now they attack and defeat in one shot. I think you got a stew going there, and I think that's pretty good. I'm excited to see the next draft of this deck, or if you have any other decks to send me, there is a form in the video description below. And if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I am always grateful. The channel is growing and any help will always be appreciated. All right, good luck.